If you believe these stories must be remembered, subscribe to Echoes of Valor and help keep history alive.
At dawn on June 22, 1941, the world held its breath. From the forests of East Prussia to the endless plains of Poland, an ocean of men and machines stood silent, poised like a coiled spring. 3 million German soldiers, along with 500,000 troops from their Axis allies, waited for the signal that would ignite the largest invasion in human history. Codename Operation Barbarossa. Objective: the conquest of the Soviet Union, the destruction of communism, and the birth of Hitler's 1,000-year Reich. As the first rays of sun touched the eastern horizon, the stillness broke. A thunder of engines roared to life. Tanks, trucks, and motorcycles surged forward. Artillery lit up the sky. Above, the Luftwaffe streaked eastward, its bombers casting dark shadows over fields that only hours earlier had been at peace. This was no ordinary offensive. It was a crusade, one born of ideology, arrogance, and fear. Hitler believed that in a few short months, the Soviet Union would collapse like a house of cards. He was wrong, fatally wrong.
By the end of the first day, the Wehrmacht had advanced more than 50 miles into Soviet territory. Entire Soviet divisions were encircled before they even knew they were at war. Communication lines collapsed, airfields burned, thousands of planes were destroyed before ever leaving the ground. In the west, Army Group North struck toward Leningrad. In the center, Army Group Center moved relentlessly toward Smolensk and then Moscow. And in the south, Army Group South drove into Ukraine, seeking the vast wheat fields and oil-rich regions beyond. The Soviets were stunned, paralyzed by disbelief. In the Kremlin, Stalin sat motionless for hours upon hearing the news. Hitler wouldn't attack us, he had insisted again and again. Now, reality shattered that illusion.
The Red Army, despite its size, was unprepared. Purges in the late 1930s had wiped out much of its experienced officer corps. Tanks were outdated, planes scarce, and logistics chaotic. And yet, amid the confusion, resistance began to form. In Brest, Soviet soldiers fought to the last man within the fortress walls. For days they endured relentless bombing and assaults, carving defiant words on the bricks. "We will die, but we will not surrender."
Through July, the German advance seemed unstoppable. Columns of panzer tanks raced across the open steppe, enveloping Soviet forces in one encirclement after another. At Minsk, 300,000 Soviet troops were captured. At Smolensk, another 200,000 fell. The road to Moscow appeared wide open. German soldiers wrote home with confidence and awe. "The war will be over by Christmas," they said. But beneath that optimism lay the first signs of trouble. Supply lines stretched thin across hundreds of miles. Fuel and ammunition began to run low. The same roads that carried the panzers forward were soon choked with dust, mud, and broken vehicles. And then there was the vastness, the endlessness of the land itself. A German officer would later write, "In the east, the distances are like the sea. You advance, and yet the horizon never moves." The further they went, the slower they became.
By August, the Soviets began to adapt. new commanders emerged from the chaos, men like Zhukov, Rokossovsky, and Vatuchin. They reorganized what was left of the shattered divisions, redeployed reserves, and began to fight with a desperate ferocity the Germans had not anticipated. When German units reached the outskirts of Smolensk, they encountered not retreating enemies, but counterattacks. Soviet T-34 tanks, previously underestimated, proved nearly invincible to most German guns. Their thick armor and wide tracks gave them a terrifying advantage in both firepower and maneuverability. German tank crews were stunned. "How do we fight these monsters?" one officer asked. But still, the Wehrmacht pressed on. Moscow was now less than 250 miles away. And Hitler, watching from his headquarters, became consumed with impatience. He overruled his generals, ordering them to divert crucial divisions southward towards Tver, seeking to annihilate the Soviet forces there before continuing toward the capital. It was a fatal mistake.
The Kiev operation became one of the largest encirclements in history. Over 600,000 Soviet troops were trapped as the German pincers closed around the Ukrainian capital. Hitler hailed it as his greatest victory, the proof that the Soviet Union was collapsing. But that triumph came at a cost of precious time. Weeks were lost as the Wehrmacht redeployed northward again. Autumn had arrived, and with it, the rains. The same open fields that once allowed the panzers to glide like lightning now turned to oceans of mud. Vehicles bogged down, supply trucks got stuck, and horses, the unsung backbone of the German army, collapsed from exhaustion. The soldiers called it the Rasputitsa, the season of impassable roads. It slowed everything: food, ammunition, reinforcements. Men starved, froze, and fell ill. But Hitler's orders were clear: Moscow must fall before the winter. And so they marched, through the mud, through the cold, through the dying light of a campaign that had gone too far. By early December 1941, German troops could see the towers of the Kremlin through their binoculars. They were less than 20 miles from the Soviet capital. The exhausted soldiers believed that one final push would end the war. But the weather turned against them. Temperatures plunged to -30 degrees Celsius. Engines froze, guns jammed. Clothing, designed for summer victories, offered no protection from the Arctic winds. For the first time, German soldiers felt fear, a deep, silent fear that crept into their bones. Letters home spoke of the endless cold, of comrades frozen in their foxholes, of the haunting silence between artillery bursts. And then came the counterattack. On December 5th, the Red Army, reinforced, reorganized, and driven by sheer survival, launched a massive offensive along the entire front. Fresh Siberian divisions, hardened by years of cold, struck the exhausted Germans with overwhelming force. The Wehrmacht reeled backward. For the first time in the war, Hitler's army retreated. By January 1942, Operation Barbarossa was over. The dream of conquering the Soviet Union in a few months had died in the snows outside Moscow. The German army had lost over 1 million men. Thousands of tanks and aircraft were gone. But more than that, their illusion of invincibility was shattered. In the east, villages lay in ruins. Fields that once fed millions were blackened and burned. And the people, the ordinary men and women, bore the true cost. They endured hunger, fear, and loss on a scale unimaginable. For Germany, what was meant to be a lightning victory became a war of attrition, one they could never win. And for the Soviet Union, it was just the beginning of a long, bitter road to ultimate victory.
As the snow fell over the smoking ruins, one thought echoed through the frozen night. The same arrogance that had fueled the invasion would now consume its creators. Operation Barbarossa had begun as a march of triumph. It ended as the first step toward destruction.
Winter 1941-1942 was not merely a pause, it was a reckoning. For the German High Command, the realization came slowly, painfully. The war in the East would not end quickly. The logistical failures were catastrophic. The Wehrmacht had advanced too far, too fast on roads that barely existed. Trucks broke down by the thousands. Horses, over 600,000 of them, perished in the cold. Fuel depots were hundreds of miles behind the front. Ammunition trains arrived days, sometimes weeks, too late. The entire machine of Blitzkrieg, built on speed and coordination, had ground to a halt. And yet Hitler refused to yield. He saw retreat as weakness, hesitation as betrayal. When his generals pleaded to fall back and regroup, he shouted, "No step backward." This single order would haunt his armies for years to come.
In the early months of 1942, the German High Command faced a brutal question. What now? They no longer had the strength for another massive offensive like Barbarossa, yet Hitler demanded one. He saw the Soviet Union as a wounded beast, bleeding, staggering, but still dangerous. To destroy it completely, he turned his gaze south. The new objective was the Caucasus oil fields, the lifeblood of Soviet industry. Without oil, the Red Army would wither. With it, the Reich could fuel its armies indefinitely. Thus was born Operation Blue, the next great gamble. But even as the Germans prepared for this new campaign, the Soviets were learning. They had begun to master the art of defense in depth. Layers of trenches, anti-tank ditches, and concealed artillery. They used the terrain, the weather, and sheer manpower to their advantage. Stalin, once paranoid and paralyzed, now delegated to capable commanders. Zhukov, in particular, became the architect of Soviet resilience. He studied the Germans, predicted their movements, and turned their speed into their weakness. For every kilometer the Wehrmacht gained, it bled.
In June 1942, German columns once again thundered eastward, but this time the advance lacked the electricity of the year before. There was no surprise, no illusion of invincibility. The land was already scarred, villages reduced to ash, bridges blown apart, fields turned to mud by thousands of tracks. Still, Hitler demanded progress. His armies split, one thrusting toward Stalingrad, the other toward the oil fields of Baku. It was a decision driven by greed and pride, not by strategy. Dividing his forces meant dividing his strength, a fatal error repeated throughout the campaign. By August, the advance slowed once more. Fuel shortages crippled the tanks, men collapsed from heat and exhaustion, and in the distance, on the banks of the Volga River, stood a city whose name would soon become synonymous with death: Stalingrad.
The Battle of Stalingrad was not part of Barbarossa itself, but it was its direct child, born from the same arrogance and momentum. Here, the last embers of the dream to conquer the East would be extinguished. From September 1942 onward, the city became a nightmare of fire and steel. Street by street, house by house, room by room, soldiers fought with knives, grenades, and bare hands. Entire buildings changed ownership a dozen times in a single day. German troops began calling it Rattenkrieg, the Rat War. Every corner was death, every ruin a fortress. On the other side, Soviet defenders swore an oath, not one step back. There was no retreat, no surrender, only survival. Civilians dug trenches, snipers haunted the shadows, and every destroyed factory became a fortress of defiance.
The Germans eventually captured 90% of the city, but that last 10% became their grave. As winter returned, the Soviets struck back. Operation Uranus encircled over 300,000 Axis soldiers inside Stalingrad. The hunters had become the hunted. For 2 months, the trapped soldiers froze and starved, surrounded by the same landscape they had once called conquered. Hitler ordered them to stand fast, no surrender. When General Paulus finally capitulated on February 2, 1943, the illusion of Nazi invincibility was over.
Barbarossa had promised a quick war. It delivered a quagmire, a war of annihilation and attrition. Strategically, the operation revealed the fundamental flaw in Hitler's thinking. He believed ideology could substitute for logistics. He believed willpower could defeat distance, and fanaticism could replace fuel. The Wehrmacht was the finest fighting force in the world, but it was mortal. No army could survive indefinitely in a theater so vast, so hostile, and so unforgiving. Every kilometer eastward had stretched its arteries thinner until the machine itself began to suffocate. Hitler's refusal to adapt, his obsession with symbolic victories like Moscow and Stalingrad, turned tactical brilliance into strategic disaster. The generals knew it, the soldiers felt it, but no one could stop it.
Behind every arrow on a map lay unimaginable suffering. Entire villages erased, millions of civilians caught between two brutal regimes. The Nazi ideology had turned war into extermination. In their wake, Einsatzgruppen followed the army, murdering Jews, partisans, and civilians alike. The Eastern Front was not merely a battlefield, it was a machine of death. And yet, even amid horror, there were moments of fragile humanity. A German soldier sharing bread with a starving child, a Soviet nurse risking her life to save an enemy junior. Acts so small, so fleeting, yet they defied the logic of hate that surrounded them. These moments did not change the course of the war, but they reminded the world that beneath the uniforms and banners, people still remain.
By 1943, the tide had turned. The Red Army, once shattered, was now reborn, stronger, faster, and more disciplined. Soviet factories, relocated beyond the Urals, churned out thousands of tanks and aircraft every month. For every German tank destroyed, 2 new T-34s appeared. The war of speed had become a war of endurance, and in endurance, the Soviets had the advantage. The Eastern Front consumed everything: men, machines, and hope. By the end of the war, over 27 million Soviet citizens would be dead. Germany would lose nearly 6 million. Operation Barbarossa, intended to secure a final victory, instead ensured a final collapse. It is said that history repeats itself, but in the East, history screamed. It screamed through the forests of Smolensk, the ruins of Stalingrad, and the frozen plains of Moscow. And every echo carried the same message: arrogance is the enemy of strategy.
When the war finally ended in May 1945, the ruins of Berlin told a story far removed from that triumphant dawn in 1941. The same Führer who once declared that the East will be ours now hid in a bunker beneath his fallen capital. The same armies that had stormed across Europe now marched in defeat, their banners torn, their empire gone. Operation Barbarossa had begun as a campaign of conquest. It ended as a lesson written in blood and snow. A lesson about overreach, about the limits of power, about the cost of hubris.
And perhaps, most of all, about the resilience of those who refused to bow. The frozen fields that swallowed the invaders would thaw again. Cities would be rebuilt. Children would laugh where tanks once burned. But the memory, the ghost of Barbarossa, would remain, not as a symbol of glory, but as a warning.